Good day, citizens, and welcome to this week's special edition of the Theodore Roosevelt Hour.
What?
I'm joking, but it kind of was. It was great fun.
Well, I perform as both characters. When I finish doing a Roosevelt impersonation, I'm sweating and I'm exhausted, and I think, how did he live this way?
Hey, how far does this humanities stuff go?
Huh?
Like, say, for instance, I went to see a band in concert that were imitating a very famous band, say, like the Beatles.
I want to hold your hand.
Would that be humanities?
No. That's arts.
Because they were awful.
Arts.
Yeah.
But then there has to be interpretation. Someone has to break character and say, I'm not really Ringo.
Well, it's interesting because we all decided it would have been a lot better had they done that.
Well,
so.
I have to say,
I don't want to remember it too much.
There
it
are
was
lots
that
of
bad.
one-man, one-woman shows and all that. This is what I actually contributed to the Chautauqua movement. I was doing this in North Dakota with Ev Albers, the great director of the North Dakota Humanities Council. We had these people who go out and perform as somebody. And I said, no. Unless they break character and then characterize what they have done to provide context, to go back to controversial things.
Sense. It does.
Because take a bad Beatles cover band or a bad Beatles imitation band and then have them break character and say, here's why we do it.
I'm really from Omaha, but I love this. And
but here's what we don't
studied,
understand about Hey Jude and so on. That's what you want. And so that was my contribution to the movement. That's why we break character always on the third segment of this program.
Again, as usual, I've gotten us off topic. I'm sorry for that. But this book, well, first off, I would say that if there is a president that appears on this hour
other than
Jefferson and his cohorts, somebody closer to our century, it would be Theodore
Even
Roosevelt.
Though they, as the Jefferson Watch essay shows, they could not have been more different in fundamental respects.
We talked to the author, Professor
Char Miller, W.W. Keck, professor of environmental studies at Pomona.
Because
we're co-editors of this book.
And it just came out, and the title is?
It just came out. I don't even have a copy.
Yeah, you said towards the end of the show, I think you said you'd
ordered it
one off Amazon. Yeah.
But it's called Theodore Roosevelt, Naturalist in the Arena, because all of our symposia at Dickinson State are X in the arena. Roosevelt,
and you were so taken by this presentation.
We both Char Miller and I, he was our lead scholar, and we looked at each other on the last day and said,
got to be a book.
This is a book. Now, normally you don't think that. Normally at the end of a symposium you think, there was some good, some bad.
But the people who contributed, you didn't just go to their presentations, you contacted them and they...
Right then we huddled with them and said, are you willing? And normally someone says, no, I've done what I've done. You want to print it?
I'm really fascinated to read this book.
Yeah, and
I really am.
It's a deep... We didn't talk about the essay I wrote on William Hornaday and the saving of the buffalo. That's another thing. But this was so interesting, and Char is a very talented editor. So we co-edited the book, and I recruited Elliott West, who had been a keynote at another one of the talks. He's been on this program. He's a wonderful man, and he recruited a couple of other scholars to kind of fill it out so that there's no major subject about Roosevelt and conservation that doesn't get
at one point you have some high praise for Dickinson State University.
Oh my!
And they continue to do these symposia every year.
I'm the director of it. This will be our 18th coming up.
Oh, you're kidding!
18 years.
Oh my!
And this one is on Roosevelt's
I thought 7,
circle.
8, maybe.
Oh no!
Wow.
And I love it. As you know, I love to moderate and interview, as I just have done with Char Miller, more than anything else that I get to do. And every year, Sharon Kilzer and I design the theme. I get to do the greatest of all things. I get to call people like Char Miller and Elliott West and others and say, "Would you like to come to Western North Dakota to talk?" And they always say, "Do you have plane service out there? Do you have electricity yet?"
Well, that's a good place to leave it.
And then they come, and then we always take them to the Badlands, and every one of them, without a single exception, everyone who's written a book on Roosevelt who comes there says this, David: I wish I had visited the Badlands before I wrote that book.
That's
we were there on Valentine's Day a number of years ago.
Yeah, a long time ago.
It's
about
a
18 years ago.
transformative environment to be out there.
Yeah, because you can go to where the Elkhorn was. And
that was an open winter.
Anyway, let's go to the show.
And send money to the Jefferson Hour.
Yeah, is there anything you want to...
I got to quickly say that we did our last year's retreats up at Lochsaw Lodge. The new ones have been designed. You can go to the website, jeffersonhour.com, And one of them next year is on J. Robert Oppenheimer
Oh, good.
and the atomic bomb
Good.
and the decision to drop the atomic bomb.
Good.
So that's one,
I know
Oppenheimer.
that's one you've been
one of my
looking
favorite
forward
subjects.
to doing.
He's almost my favorite character, but
Yeah.
I'm just thrilled. And then we're also going to do an add-on trip in the spring to Los Alamos and
Really?
Alamogordo and so
my.
on. But that'll be later in the year. And the other one is on Thoreau's Walden and Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Walden, as you know, is, I believe, America's greatest single book. I do it every couple of years, but this time it'll be Thoreau and Whitman. So these are both in January. You can go to the website and find them. Sign up now. They're ready to go. And one is on J. Robert Oppenheimer and the decision to drop the atomic bomb, the making of the atomic bomb, Los Alamos, the women of Los Alamos, the Trinity test, Potsdam, World War II, the Cold War, and the future of nuclear proliferation in the age of North Korea and Iran. And the other one will be sort of going back to the center of my own way of seeing America, which is Henry David Thoreau's Walden, America's greatest book, and the greatest poem of America, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. So those are coming. The Lewis and Clark trip in the summer is full, but they can sign up for the year following. And then we just talked this morning about a second Jefferson in France trip,
Good.
a Jefferson in Virginia trip,
Oh, my.
and then, of course, not this March, but a year from now, John Steinbeck in California again. So go to the website.
You'll have no time for these measly little podcasts.
Oh, that's not true at all. This is such a joy. This is the second time we've had Char Miller on, and you just think, why can't they all be like that?
Yeah, I just sat back and listened.
Why can't they all be like
Which
Char
I hope
Miller?
everyone else will do. And now, for the third time, let's go to the show.
So send in your money and your gifts.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson, sometimes about other presidents as well. This week, I welcome the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, the gentleman seated across from me now, to the show. And sir, before we go anywhere, I must say, since you have returned from your latest series of retreats, your mood seems higher, your look is healthier, you seem friendly and almost un-Jeffersonian. But I wanted to talk to you this week because we should all, listeners included, take note of your recent birthday and wish you a happy birthday.
I turned 65, and I can tell you two things about that. There are only two happy things. One is Medicare. But you know what? It turns out to be less inexpensive than you thought.
It's not free.
Socialized medicine. It's a pretty hefty monthly tab.
That's a long conversation.
But Medicare.
Yeah.
So I'm now covered for the rest of my life, assuming that Congress keeps Medicare in place.
Here's your Medicare, if you can keep it.
Right. So now I have supplemental this and supplemental that. So
yeah, that's where the money comes in.
That's one benefit. And the second benefit is the geyser pass at the national parks.
Which is the best.
It's like America's greatest single bargain.
Yeah.
For $80 or something. It's for life.
I'm a year or two ahead of you, and I think I got mine for, I don't know, 20, 25.
Yeah, and it's up to 80 now, and you don't want to lose it.
Don't lose it,
They're thinking of getting rid of the program. But it not only gets you into the national parks for free, but when you go to like a campground in the national forest or something, you pay like $10 or $15 because we mollycoddle our ancient Americans, and I'm happy to do it. That's the only benefit of becoming an old man is that I get the geyser pass, which I'm going to use, and of course I get Medicare, which means, and I mean this very seriously, there's a lot wrong with Medicare, but it means that I never have to worry for the rest of my life that I will get basic coverage in this country. And there are, at this moment, in 2020, literally tens of millions of people who have to wonder if they can afford even the minimal health care provisions that America offers.
The worries of losing everything. So that's great.
Yeah, good.
You're a happy birthday. You're returned. You're tanned. You're rested.
And they all asked
you're
about
healthy.
you as usual. Where's Swenson? Does Swenson exist? Are you in the barn? Why won't he come? They say he would be great at these retreats. One was on Charles Dickens, and one was on the
How
space
little
program.
they truly know
And
about me.
I said I could neither confirm nor deny that you even exist.
Well, moving on from that, it's not only a great month for you because you've returned from all of these successful trips and you've turned 65 and all these.
Yeah, no one likes that.
But I suspect what really has you happy is that there are 2 books coming out, both which have your name attached to them.
There are 4 things that make me happy.
All right?
2 books are essentially out. We're
Right.
going to talk about one of them today.
That's right.
A 3rd book on North Dakota and the Great Plains will be out by November. And this is a very, very important project for me. I'm trying to wrestle with the identity and the future of the Northern Great Plains, asking
This is sort of a lifelong thing for you.
this is like summing up a
Yeah.
life of love of North Dakota and concern about it. And so the working title is, So Who Are We Now? You know, we were Jeffersons, agrarian family farmers. That's sort of ending. The first fully automated farm will be in place in a year or 2 in Cass County, North Dakota, not a single human being on site. Robotic, entirely robotic, drone-driven farm. And I know this is going to sound like I'm betraying my beloved North Dakota, but I've also been asking myself, what rational person would live here?
As usual, you're getting ahead of me and steering the conversation away.
And the 4th thing that I want to
see
say
my little
is,
sign here.
shame on you, Swenson. Shame
what?
on you, Catherine Jenkinson. Shame on you, all of you.
What?
My comedy program at the Roper Theater on February 25th has not only sold out, but they are turning away dozens, maybe hundreds of people.
Second performance.
You sneered, and now I am going to fill 900 seats.
Well, it's just all good marketing, isn't it?
No, no, sir.
Well,
you
congratulations.
Were wrong. You were wrong, sir.
Well, but you haven't done the show yet.
But I have a joke. Horse walks into a bar. Bartender says, "Why the long face?" It's better than that. It'll be much better than that.
Okay.
But on to Theodore Roosevelt.
I do briefly want to mention the other book, but I'm sure we'll devote a show to it.
We must.
That one, you have a pre-copy. I'm not sure what the official release date is.
The release date is late March, but there will be copies at the comedy program.
Excellent.
We're 900 people, so put that in your pipe.
Okay.
It's called Repairing Jefferson's America, A Guide to Civility and Enlightened Citizenship. We'll post a photograph today. It's a sort of a rewrite of Becoming Jefferson's People, but I doubled it in length.
You need to start like a GoFundMe so you can finance sending a copy to every senator and representative.
You know, I'm serious about this. So
I
we
know
are
you
giving
are. I
a
know you
copy
are.
to every senator,
Great.
every legislator in Virginia while I'm there at the end of this month.
Excellent.
And I'm challenging Jefferson Hour listeners. It comes to about $4.50 a book if we do a bulk thing. I would like to get a copy into the hands of legislators in North Dakota, in Montana, in Michigan, in California, in Alaska,
Well,
in
let's
Vermont.
put that aside
And
for the moment and
if
come
you're
back
interested
to it.
in helping me, Jefferson Hour listeners, we can make that happen.
That's a great idea. We'll need to formalize that and keep listeners updated. But just a little perspective, back in 2016, you recorded an audiobook version of the original book, Becoming Jefferson's People. And actually, listeners can still get that if they go to jeffersonhour.com. It's available as a download. You need to join the 1776 Club in order to get that. But you'll not only get the book and extra content, you'll be supporting the show. And you can find out all about that at jeffersonhour.com. But now, getting to our special guest, do you want to tell us about him, Clay?
We're going to interview my good friend Char Miller of Pomona College in Southern California, where I worked actually early in my career as an English professor. He's an endowed chair and professor at Pomona, and he was at a symposium that I hosted in Dickinson, North Dakota for the Theodore Roosevelt Center a couple of years ago, and it was on the theme, TR, the Naturalist in the Arena, and it was so good, the papers were just uniformly splendid, that on the last day, Char, I'll ask Char about this, we were sitting in Medora for this kind of group casual discussion with all of our guests and our lecturers, and we looked at each other simultaneously and said, "There's a book here. this is a book.
He is an author of note. We've talked about
We've
one
had
of
him
his
on-
other books, too.
He was on to talk about the Ogallala Aquifer
It was a
about a
fascinating
year ago.
book, yeah.
Great man. So we're going to interview him now. Because he and I co-edited the book. I wrote 2 of the articles in the book. He wrote 1, but he and I shared the introduction, and I really want to get his perspective.
Well,
I don't even have a copy of the book yet, but he has 10 in his hands.
We actually have him on the line now.
Hello, Char Miller. Are you there, sir? The book, we wanted to pick your brain.
Absolutely. You could have picked your own brain, but I'm glad you're picking mine.
I'd rather pick yours. Are you ready to go for a while?
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
So Char Miller is the W.M. Keck Professor of Environmental Analysis at Pomona College and a former professor of history at Trinity University. Welcome, Professor Miller.
Thank you so much, Clay. It's great to be on.
You were on, of course, before when we talked about your book on the Ogallala Aquifer, and we got a lot of great response to that, so welcome back.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was a fun conversation. This should be even more fun.
I was explaining to David and our listeners that I hosted this symposium at Dickinson State University at the Theodore Roosevelt Center on TR, the Naturalist in the Arena, and the talks were uniformly outstanding, really better than I think in any symposium we ever had. And at the end, on Saturday, in the Rough Rider Hotel in Medora, you and I looked at each other across a table and essentially simultaneously said, "There's a book here." Do you remember that moment?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I remember it. In fact, you just gave me chills because I remember the conversation. And, I was sitting in the audience listening to others speak before we had that sort of visual conversation. And I remember the first paper, Darren Lundy's essay, and it was like, wow, that's really good. And then the second came on, I went, that's really good too, Dwayne Junts. And then the third one came on, I went, okay, wait a second. This is looking like a book, and I didn't have any idea what I was talking about at the moment. But it's been a blast working with you on it, and as you well know, working with our colleagues who were kind of amazing. They all said, "Oh yeah, let's do that." It was like, okay, cool.
So from the hundreds of conferences and symposia that you've gone to in the course of your distinguished career, that it's not always like that you go and you're there for 2 or 3 days and you think, "Oh, that was excellent, that one." And then there are some that are okay and some that are, frankly, not very interesting. The fact that everyone was interesting and that they were complementary, but they were not overlapping, struck me as very unusual.
Yeah, I think it was unusual. There was one story, and I'm sure it's not apocryphal, but it gets talked about a lot, is the story of Roosevelt and the seal on Broadway when he's a child that really sort of turned his mind towards a naturalist life. But that aside, that was the only thing I had to clip out of some of the essays because everybody talked about it. But there's a reason why everybody talked about it and used it as a kind of pivot point for what they were doing, because this guy, from a very young age, he had this remarkable sense of himself at 7 or 8 years old, that the world was something he needed to investigate, like a detective, which a naturalist essentially is. And, I came to history sort of through similar ways, but kind of later. I'm in college when I'm having these insights, and he had them so young, and he was right. He was right about himself. He was right about the world as it was diminishing, and he wanted to see it before it disappeared. And it really shaped his life, and frankly, it shapes this book.
We think of Roosevelt as a soldier in Cuba. We think of Roosevelt as the president of the United States. We think of him as the police commissioner of New York City. We think of him as an explorer in the Amazon basin after his time as president. We think of him as a man of letters. But we need to take a break here, but we tend not to remember that he originally had planned to be a professional naturalist.
Yeah, absolutely right. And that's sort of staggering given that list of things that you said, that he turned from that, though he didn't really, and did all of these other remarkable things like being a police commissioner. Who wants to do that?
We're going to take a short break. We're talking to Char Miller, the distinguished professor of history at Pomona College in Southern California. We're talking about our new book, which we co-edited, Theodore Roosevelt, Naturalist in the Arena. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We're talking with Char Miller, my friend and co-editor of the new book by the University of Nebraska Press, Theodore Roosevelt Naturalist in the arena. Char, when I started putting together that symposium, I called Darren Lundy, who has written this really splendid book called The Naturalist about this very subject, and he gave one of the really remarkable lectures at that symposium. And so I think a question that any student of Roosevelt might ask is, why another book on this subject? What are we doing with our book that wasn't already really well done in Mr. Lundy's book?
Well, two things. One, Darren's book is fantastic. The essay that he wrote for us actually in this anthology is different from that book. And here's what I love about Darren and the others in the catalog in this collection. Many of them have written about the subjects before, and they all rewrote them and rethought them and put in new material. And so, for example, Darren's book really focused on Roosevelt in a way that's quite surprising because he sort of broke new ground about Roosevelt. And what we have done in the collection is to follow that trail and then push beyond it. And so it's right that his is the first chapter, but it's quickly followed, I think, in ways that really struck me as these talks unfolded in different ways. So if he's a naturalist and he, as a naturalist does, writes about that, wouldn't it be logical to have Tom Bailey and Catherine Joslin, who have just written about Roosevelt as a writer, help us understand what it is not when he saw the animals, captured them, and turned them through taxidermy into something that would go to a museum, but then he reflects. And that's the stuff I love. And in fact, they have two photographs in their essay where we see Roosevelt writing in his tent. And, there's the man thinking and writing simultaneously. So that makes a great deal of sense. And then the other piece that I think two other pieces that helps forge a new way of thinking about Roosevelt is not with the big animals that he went after that Darren talks about, but the birds that he loved and rarely shot.
Dwayne Junt's excellent essay on T.R. the ornithologist.
When I heard that one, my jaw dropped. I mean, Darren's I thought was going to be great, but I didn't know Dwayne's work. And the most jaw-dropping moment is when Dwayne sort of looked at Roosevelt's love of the meadowlark and realized that he fell in love with that beautiful bird in the Great Plains at the same moment, effectively, when he's mourning his wife and his mother.
It is the most characteristic sound of the Great Plains. And Dwayne not only got that, but he knew that it had great local appeal, too, at a symposium at Dickinson State.
Yes.
And let me just pause there to say all hail to Dickinson State University and the Theodore Roosevelt Center and Sharon Kilzer and her staff. The symposia that we put on, as you know, have achieved some national prominence, and we're thrilled. But I want to ask you about another one of the essays, Melanie Chukas Bradley. So she came, and she's an expert on Rock Creek Park in the District of Columbia and also TR Island, which has the main monument to TR in our federal capital. At the time, Rock Creek Park was way more important than it is today, and TR, because he had to get out in nature, spent a lot of time out there, and it was sort of his local wilderness.
That was another one of those jaw-dropping moments when I was like, wait, how did I not know this? I know this guy, and I actually, he and Pinchot loped through that area, so I had written a bit about that, but I knew it not the way that Melanie knows it, in part because she leads hikes through that space and knows every tree and every flower, but she really, as you say, drilled into Roosevelt's relationship with us, so much so, and this part really cracked me up. Roosevelt liked sticking his beak into stories that weren't necessarily his purview, but as president, he got away with it. And so he would write the superintendent of that park and say, by the way, you're not doing your job in protecting this landscape. And there's all of these letters that not only show his love for the landscape, but his full throttle effort to compel an employee to do his job and do it better. And I loved that sort of intimacy about a small place in Washington that he adored, and also recognizing that he, the politician, had some pop and could sort of effectively force someone to do work that person didn't particularly want to do when Roosevelt really wasn't his boss.
Yeah, he's meddling, essentially. He's saying, I don't like the way the paving stones are here, and you need to do this. And he's micromanaging the work of a minor office that has nothing to do with the national government of the United States, and by the way, feels perfectly willing to do that, to step in and say, I don't like what you're doing here.
Yeah, no, it's exactly right. And that really then sets up the second section, which is about the way in which he interacted with people like himself, and sort of that he doesn't have to meddle with because they're really on the same page. And so John Reiger has written beautifully about George Bird Grinnell. I did a piece, as you mentioned, about Pinchot and Roosevelt. Barb Rosenstock, who knew that a child's book author could help us understand how to turn history and tell history about a relationship between John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt in a child's book. But then what she did in her talk, which was, by the way, out loud funny, she helped me understand that there's a bigger audience out there. And if you think about how you work your way through an archive and can tell the story as historians do in a sort of academic way, or flip that lid and flip that story and narrative and think out what does a 7-year-old want to know?
When I invited her, I really kind of took a chance, because here we have this, sort of this grown-up symposium, and I saw her book, which I really liked. It's a children's book on T.R. and John Muir and the Yosemite journey of 1903. And I said to my colleague Sharon Kilser, this is a bit of a gamble, but what if we invited her? Because Roosevelt is not just for academics. He's not just for adults.
Yes.
He loved children. He was essentially a grown-up child himself. And so we invited her.
Totally.
I thought, whatever happens, this will be interesting. But it turned out to be spectacular. As you say, she was extremely funny. And then the next thing is, okay, when they say in Congress, I want the right to revise and refine my my talk before it goes into the congressional record, we asked each scholar to go back and take a look. And she sent in this really extraordinary essay, article about John Muir, Theodore Roosevelt, the famous 1903 conservation trip, and that spectacular 3-day period in Yosemite National Park. And in my opinion, she broke some new ground.
Yeah. And, the other piece of that, and you're spot on in terms of the way in which she approached it, is she talked about the historical method, how you get into an archive and you sift through it and you go, well, I'm not sure that story is true. And so let's toss that one out because this one looks better and more authoritative. It was mind-blowingly good. And, I want to ask you questions actually about the two pieces that you wrote for it because they're very important. But before we do so, let's talk a bit about Elliott West and Ian Tyrell.
I want to interrupt you there just for a moment because this is so interesting. The book is just out, Theodore Roosevelt, Naturalist in the Arena, University of Nebraska Press. I think everyone can tell we're immensely proud of it. I think it's going to be a major piece of Roosevelt's studies and a huge contribution to our understanding of Roosevelt. And the first review by Publishers Weekly nailed it, I think. They said they didn't just give us another rah-rah pro-Roosevelt book. They have carefully examined the parts of Roosevelt's achievement and legacy that are less admirable or less well understood in our time, including his policies with respect to Native Americans and his youthful flirtation with other members of the conservation community that were engaged in the eugenics movement. So I think Elliott West and Ian Tyrell's essays are extremely important for that purpose. Can you sort of characterize what we're talking about here?
Yeah, so one of the things that we talked about very early in the process was that we had some really great pieces, but we were missing some stories. And Elliott West and Ian Tyrell, who's an Australian scholar, have written a very important work on Roosevelt and more broadly about conservation in the progressive era. And so we reached out to them. They jumped on board. I mean, it was like the email went out and an email came back. And Ian Tyrell is now retired. Actually, they're both retired, but they really wanted to revise stuff that they have done in the past, and they did. It's really, really cool. So one of the things that Elliott West does is to situate Roosevelt in the West of reality and in the imagination of what he calls the new America. And part of what he's doing is flipping another narrative in which those who, like Roosevelt at various moments and others, thought about the West as this final frontier for white people, and sort of imagined a West that actually doesn't exist. And so one of the cool things that Elliott does in his essay is to sort of look demographically at the places that they're describing, and what they're saying about the West, in fact, demographically isn't true. North Dakota and other places are some of the most diverse landscapes in the United States in terms of who lives there. And so if they imagine the West was a refuge from the teeming urban East filled with all sorts of unsavory types, it turns out they were completely wrong in terms of that sort of imagined landscape. And then Ian Tyrell flips the story in another direction by looking at the way in which, as you know, Teddy Roosevelt had a huge following around the world. And so Ian sort of was interested in that. Like, how does that happen? What does that mean? Why did newspapers follow his path everywhere he went? And even to places he didn't go, Roosevelt was like this, what would you call him? Like the A-list celebrity of his day. And so where he went, it's like TMZ or whatever, right? They're going to follow him. And so he was really interested in that following and sort of wrote about Roosevelt from the vantage point of being abroad, and what it meant to Australians and New Zealanders and people elsewhere, that Roosevelt was Roosevelt. And I think did a beautiful job of situating him and this emerging nation that he seemed to represent in a context that early in the 20th century, nobody knew we were going to be a world power. We had those aspirations. But one of the things Ian has done beautifully is to sort of think about conservation in this context, and thus this man as what would we call him, an ambassador, an advocate, all of those things, because he was all of those things.
And that takes us back to our original thought, which is that this book fills some vacuums in Roosevelt studies.
Yes.
I was stunned by those essays, because I've frankly never thought about Roosevelt's conservation practices in the international arena of Australia, New Zealand, Africa, and Europe before, and that essay just nailed that. And I also think it's really important to realize that, and I think you've done some work that's about to be published in another book on this, that our national forests, our national parks, our national monuments, and our national wildlife refuges are frequently carved out of sovereign Indian lands. And that we didn't go in great detail on that subject in our book, but it's important to realize that something like Glacier National Park or the National Buffalo Range in northwestern Montana were taken from what was left of Native American landscapes, and this was done without a lot of controversy or fanfare. It was just assumed that this was an okay thing to do. Today, we're bringing new sensitivity to those questions.
Yes, that's right. And I inserted some material about Pinchot and his role in that, and Roosevelt's role in that, in terms of the allotments that under TR, particularly the transfer, and that's a nice word for it, of ancestral and/or treaty lands into the national forests was astonishingly large number. Close to 50% of the national forests that were created that we have now, of 193 million acres, were original ancestral and/or treaty lands that were absorbed into the national forest. Now, part of the Roosevelt-Pinchot conception of this was that land was going to disappear anyway, so what do we want it to disappear into? But that presumes that they could have said no, and they could have done. So you're right. There's this notion that unsavory, I guess, by 21st century standards, certainly, and critiquable, absolutely, as we do, I think. And that's another piece that again, as we were listening to the talks, I was going, oh my goodness, we really got something here that really does push the boundaries. This is not hagiography. This is not Roosevelt without fault.
At the same point, Char, as you know, I'm talking to Char Miller of Pomona College, the co-editor of this extraordinary book on Theodore Roosevelt. just published by the University of Nebraska Press. You can get it immediately from Amazon.com, and it will be in your favorite bookstore too. But as you know, Char, our symposium and this book are not meant to be revisionist critiques of Roosevelt, not at all. This is a celebratory book, but our concept at the TR Center, as you know, is to look at the whole man, the whole achievement, nuance and all, and that there are parts of Roosevelt that anyone on earth can celebrate and take joy in, and then there are parts of Roosevelt that are harder to understand, and some of it, frankly, in the 21st century is a little, at times, hard to swallow, and we're not afraid of that. You're not afraid of that. I think that's one of the things that will make this book important.
I think that's right. And I think the other piece, and this is where I get to interview you a little bit, is also how do we size this guy up? How do we remember him? And I need to interview you, Clay, because you actually asked the question, can we actually memorialize this man of so many parts, so many facets? And if we did, what would we do? How would we do it? So help us understand that part of him.
I found this just so fascinating. I was asked to give a talk at the 50th anniversary of TR Island and the Potomac in Washington, D.C., where the TR monument in the federal capitol exists. And I have to say, I'm always a little bit edgy about it because I think you should not be able to go to Washington, D.C. without having a bigger experience of the 26th president than you do. As you know, many people aren't even aware of TR Island, and those who are aware of it don't necessarily go. And so I began to look into this, and this is where the method comes back, Char. I went back and started to see, how did he want to be memorialized? You know, what's adequate for TR? And what I found astounded me, and I think you too. He said, don't put up statues to me.
Yes.
He actually got very fatalistic and said, how long is a man's memory really going to last? Like a generation or two? Who do we remember? You know, Julius Caesar or Attila the Hun or Cicero. You know, we don't really remember people that long. He said this would be a mistake, and he actually warned the governor of North Dakota not to put up a statue of Roosevelt on the Capitol grounds in Bismarck. He said, put up a pioneer family. That's really the spirit of North Dakota. I love that. And so Roosevelt wrote these really extraordinary, for him, really humble letters about his place in history. And so what I conclude, which is straight out of the Char Miller playbook, is that if you want to see his monument, go to Wind Cave National Park, go to the Grand Canyon, go to Devil's Tower, go to Olympia in Washington, that his setting aside 230 million acres of the public domain as national park, national forest, national wildlife refuge, national monument is really the principal monument to Roosevelt's greatness. And you don't need to see a plaque somewhere or a statue to get that.
Right. And I think first of all, that was such a perfect way to conclude the book, to be honest, in part because it sort of captures the naturalist that Darren opens the book with a sort of naturalistic vision of how he wished to be remembered in these incredible landscapes that he set aside. And we still talk about that achievement. In fact, earlier this week on Tuesday, I was talking with Forest Service employees in Ogden, and I said, one of the things that you guys do is you get to steward 193 million beautiful acres. And I said 150 million of those came out of one administration.
One man.
One guy, and Pinchot was important, but he wasn't the chief executive. He was just the chief of the agency. And, you think about that, it's like, that's astonishing. And he's right, I think, in the end, that those places will live way beyond perhaps our memory of Roosevelt himself.
We need to take a short break here, Char. We're going to come back. When we do come back, I want to ask you about your essay on Pinchot, and I want to do a couple more things with respect to this really remarkable new book, Theodore Roosevelt, The Naturalist in the Arena, from the University of Nebraska Press. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, out of character this week, talking with my friend from Pomona College, where I spent some time as a very young English professor. Char Miller is the co-editor of the new book, Theodore Roosevelt, Naturalist in the Arena, University of Nebraska Press. We edited it together. It was one of the great joys of my life, and it has led to some other things that each of us is going to do. Char, you wrote I invited you to come. I started to look at TR the Naturalist, and I said, we have to have a lecture on Gifford Pinchot, and of course that inevitably puts you in the lens. And so I called you, and you were gracious enough to come to Western North Dakota and gave a really outstanding talk on Gifford Pinchot. Quickly, tell us who he was and why he's so important to Roosevelt.
Pinchot and Roosevelt had this remarkable relationship. Gifford Pinchot had joined the federal government in 1898 to head up the division and then the Bureau of Forestry, which had no land whatsoever. But he was ambitious, and it turns out, boy, his ambition dovetailed with that of Teddy Roosevelt to build what we now call the Forest Service, to move 150 million acres out of the Department of Interior and cross the street over to the Department of Agriculture. And you can imagine how happy the Interior was at that loss. And then begin to do what had not yet been done, which is to manage those lands for multiple purposes. On the one hand, for economic resources, and on the other hand, to protect that landscape so that subsequent generations could enjoy those resources every bit as much as those in what we now call the Progressive Era, the pre-World War I period, enjoyed them. And that, in Pinchot's mind and in Roosevelt's mind, that was a radical shift in terms of how we thought about public lands. We used to give them away to railroads. People stole them. We were okay with that, apparently. We, sort of sold them for homesteading, and that produced a remarkable surge of people into places like North and South Dakota and every place else in the West. But what they were about, and you can see it in their relationship, is two men imagined the world that we now live within.
He said, nature has been at work on it and man can only mar it. One of the greatest things that he ever said, and said spontaneously. I want to ask you another question about Pinchot, but first I want to say think of Jefferson and Madison, think of the great partnerships in American history. The partnership of Pinchot and Roosevelt is of incalculable importance. That partnership proved to be one of the principal relationships in Theodore Roosevelt's life. They were somewhat different men, and I want you to tell this story when Pinchot first went to Albany to meet Governor Theodore Roosevelt and what happened in the State House there.
Pinchot was on his way to hike in the Adirondacks, but wanted to stop off, and I think he and Roosevelt had met before, hence the invitation to the governor's mansion in Albany. But these two guys, they're very competitive. And so in addition to sharing things, like-mindedness in terms of philosophy and ethics and the like, they also like to pummel one another. And so Roosevelt foolishly suggested that they start with boxing.
Do you want to wrestle? Do you want to box?
Yeah, and so Pinchot's 6 feet tall. He's got a long reach. Roosevelt didn't stand a chance, and as Pinchot said, he had great pleasure, he wrote later, putting the future president on his tush.
Knocking him off his pins. And when he got there, when he got to the residence, he said the children were being lowered by a rope by the governor of New York because there was a quote-unquote Indian attack on the house.
Yes. Yeah, and as you said earlier, the man was a grown-up boy and loved that. But, Roosevelt then recovered, having been knocked off his pins, and said, let's wrestle. And keep in mind, Roosevelt is a stocky, low-to-the-ground kind of guy. He's a good wrestler, and Pinchot was pinned almost immediately because he was thin as a rail. But I actually love that sweaty embrace. Right, that these guys had no limits in terms of their relationships, and I think they saw the world in the same way. That if you thought cleanly and clearly about what it is you want, and have the capacity to think politically, and these guys were political animals. They knew what the traps were. They, as one says about Nancy Pelosi, they knew how to see around corners. They knew what the opposition was thinking before the opposition even thought it through.
Char Miller, I won't ask you the last time you boxed with somebody at Scripps or Claremont McKenna or at Stanford or wrestled somebody at a conference. This is a pretty strange part of their career. I want you to tell one more story. We're almost out of time. When you gave your great talk at Dickinson State, again for the book that's now Theodore Roosevelt, Naturalist in the Arena, you said that Mrs. Pinchot, yes, Pinchot's mother, actually sort of snapped TR in the nose when he was writing his autobiography. Tell that story.
Yeah. So Roosevelt's autobiography, which is not one of his best books, I have to say. It's pretty workmanlike in prose. Nonetheless, has a chapter on conservation. And it now includes a pretty generous set of praises for Pinchot and the work that he did, but the original draft did not. And Roosevelt sent Pinchot the draft of this autobiography, including the chapter. And Gifford Pinchot spent an evening reading it out loud to his mother. Mary Eno Pinchot was nobody's fool. She came from a good deal of wealth and had all sorts of cousins and uncles who had been in the Senate and Congress. She knew her way around the halls of power, and she was a very powerful woman. And she heard the original draft, which included not a word about Pinchot and his role in the conservation movement that Roosevelt sort of headed. And she was not happy. And Pinchot relates, and again, correspondence seems to confirm this, that his mother got up from the chair listening to her son. She was at this point in her late 70s, early 80s, arthritic, could hardly hold the pen, and wrote what I think I can, because I've got a copy of the letter, is a blistering letter to the President of the United States.
Who had to take it from her.
Yeah, and said, I'm sorry, this is not going to work. You know, your husband, my son, has done some pretty hard work for you, and you need to justify his presence. This is what his enemies want. They want you to write him out of history, and you wouldn't be in history without my son. So rewrite this. And by God, TR wrote it. And one of the things that as I was digging around with this story, I was reading through Doug Brinkley's huge biography of Teddy Roosevelt, and he talks about the final day of Roosevelt in Washington, and all of his friends coming to bid him goodbye to the train. And I went back to the New York Times article that Doug mentions, and Doug got it kind of wrong because he said he was talking to Pinchot and spending most of his time with Pinchot. It turns out what he was really doing was talking to Gifford's mother. And the New York Times reporter puts it, Roosevelt lingered, talking with her longer than to any of the others. He repeated to her over and over again how loyal Mr. Pinchot had stood by his side, and Roosevelt told her goodbye with apparent regret. And I'm reading that going, oh, he already got the letter.
Yeah. Wow. Char Miller is the W.M. Keck Professor of Environmental Analysis at Pomona College, a prolific author, my dear friend. Thanks for being with us today. We'll talk to you again. This is delightful. And there's more to say, but I'm sure that this is the beginning of a number of conversations about this new book, Theodore Roosevelt, Naturalist in the Arena. Take care, my friend.
Thank you so much.
And thanks so much to the both of you. Now, sir, it is time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
This is the Thomas Jefferson Hour. So why are we talking about Theodore Roosevelt today? Theodore Roosevelt was the 26th president of the United States. He took office 100 years after Thomas Jefferson became the third president. They are condemned to spend eternity on Mount Rushmore together, right next to each other, in fact. There's no way that Jefferson could have admired the hectic, bombastic, extra-constitutional, war-loving Roosevelt, who was a self-professed Hamiltonian. Jefferson was elegant, understated, and a small R Republican who wanted the United States to be a fourth or fifth-ranked country like China then or Canada now. He envisioned a nation of highly educated family farmers. Theodore Roosevelt dragged America, sometimes kicking and screaming, onto the world stage. He did not, like Jefferson, defer to the constitutional supremacy of the legislative branch. In fact, he once called the Senate a concatenation of shrill eunuchs. Jefferson advocated strict construction of the Constitution, refusing even to create a national museum to house the Lewis and Clark artifacts without an enabling constitutional amendment first. Jefferson argued that we must never do more than is specifically enumerated in the Constitution. Roosevelt scoffed at such a notion, said strict construction would have straitjacketed the United States into permanent imbecility, both at home and abroad. Roosevelt argued that he could do anything not specifically prohibited by the Constitution. That would have given Jefferson one of his periodic migraine headaches. Roosevelt didn't really give a darn about family farmers, though he loved ranchers, and particularly cowboys, among whom he numbered himself after his adventures in Dakota Territory, my beloved North Dakota. In fact, TR said that he never would have been president of the United States were it not for his time as a cowboy in the Dakota Badlands. One may question that lovely pronouncement. Ambition, after all, does find a way. But North Dakotans love it, of course, which is one reason why we are building a TR Presidential Library in or near Medora, North Dakota, at the portal of Theodore Roosevelt National Park. It's hard to imagine Thomas Jefferson punching out a drunken gunslinger in a frontier saloon or galloping through a midnight thunderstorm to stop a stampede. He was too refined for such things and even too frail. It is equally hard to imagine Roosevelt building a domed Palladian villa for himself on Long Island or mastering ancient Greek for the purpose of reading Homer in the original. Each of them was a great leader for his own time and place. Not all leaders need to be the same. In fact, leaders who cling to outworn approaches, like Herbert Hoover or James Buchanan, wind up in the tipster of history. Jefferson wanted a small R republic. Roosevelt wanted a capital E empire. Jefferson said, "Peace is my passion." Roosevelt would have sneered at that. Jefferson's annual messages to Congress were all under 1,000 words in length. Roosevelt's first annual message to Congress, one of the longest in American history, took more than 2.5 hours for the clerk to read to the stunned and glossy-eyed members of Congress. What they shared beyond love of this country and a special fascination with the American West was love of books. Jefferson wrote just one, Notes on the State of Virginia, and that somewhat reluctantly. Roosevelt wrote about 40, depending on how you count, some of them now regarded as American classics. Jefferson had a library of almost 7,000 volumes. Roosevelt read a book a day almost every day of his adult life. Theodore Roosevelt may have been the best intellectually prepared president in American history, more even than the bookish and cerebral Jefferson, more even than John Adams, who was a voracious, pugnacious, and aggressive reader, more even than John Quincy Adams, who was brilliantly, even obsessively educated. Jefferson read in 7 languages, Roosevelt 5. If they could ever have gotten over their profound differences of character and style, they would have had much to discuss. Neither drank spirits. Roosevelt was a sarsaparilla man. Jefferson said he could not live without wine, but he never consumed it in excess. So why did Roosevelt despise Thomas Jefferson? There are 3 reasons, I think. First, Jefferson was a strict constructionist and a minimalist with respect to government. That government is best which governs least. Roosevelt was a maximalist and a broad constructionist, or to put it in a nutshell, Roosevelt was a Hamiltonian and Jefferson was, well, a Jeffersonian. Second, Jefferson loved peace and believed that the United States should only engage in war if it were the very last melancholy response when every possible attempt at peaceful resolution had been tried and then tried again, and that a nation should mourn when it had to take up arms against another sovereign people. Roosevelt, to put it lightly, had no such misgivings about war. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, first president to earn it, and his 7 years, 171 days as president were characterized by peace, not war. But he earnestly believed that war is good for a country from time to time because it crushed the softness, what he called the effeminacy, out of a nation's social fabric. He also believed that all great nations have been warring nations, and it simply has to be admitted he thirsted for military glory. He loved war and knocked down a series of difficult hurdles to get himself to Cuba in 1898 so that he could experience what he called my crowded hour. Roosevelt believed that Jefferson and his lackey Madison were pacifist ideologues who had made America vulnerable by reducing the size of the Army and Navy to nullities in the run-up to the War of 1812, which TR believed could have been avoided if we had armed ourselves properly, and would have gone much better once underway if we had prepared for it. That, I think, was his principal disgust with Jefferson, and it came from the book he wrote, much of it while a Harvard undergraduate, The Naval War of 1812. His research taught him that not only Jefferson was a bubble-headed idealist who knew nothing about the way the world really operated, but a kind of utopian visionary who preferred to live in a dream world rather than in the gritty arena that Hamilton saw and experienced during the Revolution. Hamilton called Jefferson an intellectual voluptuary, and that's essentially how TR saw him too. Third, although he does not say this directly, I think Roosevelt regarded Thomas Jefferson as a coward. He was aware, of course, of Jefferson's flight from Monticello in 1781 when the dashing British Cavalier Bannister Tarleton's dragoons rode up the mountain to arrest the governor in his Palladian mansion. That would not have set well with Roosevelt, who would have challenged Tarleton to a boxing match or a duel at 15 paces. But TR also sensed that Jefferson's soul was easily overwhelmed by conflict and tension, that Jefferson was always threatening to retire to Monticello, that he retired from the governorship after the Tarleton raid and said the criticism he received would stay with him until the all-healing grave, that Jefferson retired from George Washington's cabinet in mid-term when the daily conflict with the much more aggressive Hamilton offended his famous civility, and that Jefferson essentially abdicated the last year of his presidency when the embargo acts began to erode his enormous popularity with the American people. You will remember that in 1910 at the Sorbonne, Roosevelt spoke his most famous words, his creed, and his motto. "It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred with dust and sweat and blood." Hard to imagine Jefferson's face covered with blood. Even sweat seems a bit extreme for the sage of Monticello. I think Roosevelt's fundamental argument with Jefferson was that when the crisis came in 1776, in 1781, in 1793, and 1807, Jefferson not only didn't thrust himself into the scrum at the heart of the arena, but he could be seen edging away to his fortress of solitude in the Blue Ridge Mountains while composing love songs to our own dear Monticello, where has nature spread so rich a mantle under the eye. For Theodore Roosevelt, where the action was, there he gravitated, fists ready. For Thomas Jefferson, there was a fine glass of Bordeaux wine and a book of Greek verse waiting at his library at Monticello. Take your pick. I love and admire Theodore Roosevelt, but I regard him as a dangerous man for a nation that seeks to remain a republic. I'm with Jefferson, drifting along the Canal du Midi in southern France, writing exquisite letters to his family and friends, dreaming of utopia, and trying to persuade his fellow Americans to aspire to be their best and most civilized selves. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.